Father in heaven, we thank you for the blessing of this technology, as challenged as it may be at the present. Ask your blessing upon the use of it. Thank you for our gathering as we look at the question of science and religion, specifically Christianity, together to glorify you by increasing the harmony thereof. Thank you that Marty's back with us. Especially thank you for Travis and giving his time to be with us and edify us here today with this a book by Ian Paul. We appreciate you, and always keep in mind that it's in your light that we gain understanding, specifically through the face of the Lord Jesus Christ. So help us keep him at the center. We thank you for this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. And thank you, Lord, for getting Bryden also clicked in from far, far away. So
Bryden never gives up. He's always there,
Yeah,
even if
Bryden's
he's just
good.
a Zoom guest.
yes, we can throw challenges in front of him and it won't stop him. Well, here we are today. This is the third book in a series edited by T.F. Torrance. The series is called, what is the series called? Theology. What did he call this series? Theology and Scientific Culture. So in 1980, I believe it was, Torrance began what became a set of 5 books dealing with one of his favorite themes, the nature of science and theology. So we've looked at 2. The first one T.F. himself wrote, and in that Travis is a bit of a science expert, and particularly Einstein is of interest to him. I thought this might be interesting, which for Travis has proved to be challenging and invigorating. And so we'll have a lively conversation. I never expect anybody I ask to read or talk about anything to agree with all that's said. We simply ask for insight. And so Travis said, he might be challenging here. And I said, that's great. The nature of the work of T.F. Torrance and the scientific endeavor is that we read, we engage, we attempt to improve and understand and say, how can we do it better? So in 1982, Paul wrote this book, and Travis might talk a little bit about him being a student of T.F. Torrance and the question of to what degree did Torrance really know what it was that Paul was doing? I will actually read the one little paragraph at the beginning that Torrance writes in the general foreword, just to get a sense that Torrance did seem to approve, but Travis is going to say, what was he thinking? Or something like that. That's the short critique. So T.F. Torrance said, the Reverend Dr. Ian Paul, who gives us this very readable volume, and some people are debating that, on science, theology, and Einstein, has brought to its writing not only a double training in science and theology, but some 13 years of research and lecturing in universities in England, 6 years of work as a parish minister in Scotland. His training experience have forced him to wrestle with the nature of rigorous scientific thinking, not only in pure science, but in Christian theology as well. Moreover, in preparing this work, he spent a year at Princeton, steeping himself in the work of Einstein. I wonder if he spent time with Einstein. I can't remember what year he died. And coming to terms with his epistemological foundations. The contribution which Dr. Paul has offered us comes from deep within the intellectual activity of both sides of the discussion and will do much to reinforce the bonds that are steadily being forged between theological and scientific culture. So that's T.F. Torrance. He doesn't say much of critique. It's pretty much, here's my boy, listen to him. And he opens up the possibility of a conversation to say all kinds of things. So Travis, welcome today. Thank you for taking time. Not only here today, but you've read this book. How many times have you read this book now?
Well, just the twice.
Just the twice, yeah. So
well, once to get an overview and then to check hypotheses.
Right. So anyway, Travis has spent some serious time here.
So Albert Einstein died in 1955.
55. Albert would not
So
have been at Princeton.
no, not in
Okay.
1980-ish.
Are his papers
So let me.
there?
Oh, I would
Are
imagine so,
Einstein?
but I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And Dr. Paul would have been in high school in 1955.
Yeah.
So
Well, in high
he
school,
only
he might have been
knows.
exposed to Einstein. So, I mean, there was something triggered. So, Travis, you're going to give us an initial just kind of response to Torrance's statement and then begin to launch into some of the place that you stand in helping us to engage this text.
Let me. I'm going to begin by way of parallel to a moment. There was a particular scholar named Barry Downing, and he was a student of T.F. Torrance. He got a PhD. He was an American Presbyterian minister who did his PhD work in theology and science at the University of Edinburgh under T.F. Torrance. His dissertation is cited in Space, Time, and Incarnation, as an excellent example about Newton and space and time and all the rest. The reason why it's interesting is because he then went on to publish a very different kind of perspective on science and faith and all the rest. In particular, in 1968, Barry Downing wrote a book called The Bible and Flying Saucers, in which he stated that Jesus was an extraterrestrial sent to Earth to rid the world of sin and wickedness. He is kind of the intellectual forebears of the TV show Ancient Aliens that comes on. So what I say is to say, I think that there are situations where students of Torrance don't necessarily always continue flying in quite the same vein that Torrance does. And Ian Paul, it's what I think is the most interesting part in how. So by the way, I don't like this book, I should say. But I want to clarify. I want to clarify the reasons why, because there's certain things that he does very well, and I want to give those that credit where it is due. And I think the most telling moment in this preface that Torrance has is he makes a comment about he steeped himself in the work of Einstein and coming to terms with his epistemological foundations. If you read this book primarily as a gateway, as an introduction to Einstein and his epistemological writings, it is very good. He does a very good job in a very readable way, and does so with some historical and philosophical and scientific background that is very helpful. If someone was on the fence about what did Einstein contribute to this conversation, they would get a very excellent summary, especially in the first half of this book, where a lot of it is laid out very, very well. So I want to emphasize the fact that it's almost because it is so clearly rooted in, let me tell you about Einstein, let me tell you about his things. He clearly spent a lot of his time doing that. It reads a little bit as though that was his main point. Let me tell you about the epistemology of Albert Einstein. And then almost as if he realized, oh, this is supposed to be about theology as well. And so he tacks on an intro where he talks about thinking scientifically. And he has like kind of a short section in the middle where he talks about it, and then he kind of wraps it up. And so he starts off by saying, many Christians today share the view that the scientific enterprise and Christian faith are radically opposed to each other. And the warfare hypothesis is certainly well known. And he suggests that there are people in the pew, Christians come and talk to, this is the section 1 here. So scientists with more than a passing interest in theology are often asked by fellow Christians, are you capable of overcoming your scientific way of thinking? Now, maybe this is a generational thing, and maybe this is a different sides of the Atlantic thing. So I'm curious if anybody else, I don't know that I've ever heard that said by Christians. And what I mean by that is even Ken Ham of the Creation Research Institute thinks that thinking scientifically is a good thing. I've heard Christians say science sometimes does not take adequate account of theology and the Bible. I've heard Christians say that science goes too far in their conclusions. I've heard all kinds of things along those natures, but never once have I heard someone say we must overcome the scientific way of thinking. But he introduces the idea as if this is a question that is asked of scientists all the time by all Christians everywhere. So does somebody else have a different perspective that would help me, maybe a historical awareness of that rather than simply a rejection of it?
What do you think, Bill?
Well, I can speak to the, I had the exact same reaction, Travis. So I looked at the Pew Research Center about the issue, religion and science, and majority of people are Christians. In 2020, over 60% had no problem with it. No problem, didn't see a conflict. And they went on with some data, but I've never heard anything like that either. Any, addressing a conflict or complaining about it.
Well, I mean, I think there is a certain amount of the warfare hypothesis, but I mean, so I know that in the debate between Ken Ham and Bill Nye, Ken Ham argues that we agree on the science that produces technology. We agree on how to build spaceships. We agree on how to build satellites. We agree on how to do these various things. The difference is about applying scientific principles to the past. There's a disagreement about it, but that, as Ken Ham, I'm using him as an example that one I know about, and two is fairly radical in rejecting what we think of as being the modern scientific consensus. Even then, his concern is you're taking science too far. You're applying scientific principles in a way that is not analogous in another field of field of study. But at no point in that discussion did he say we ought not to think scientifically. Might be a debate about what exactly it means to think scientifically, in what ways it's appropriate to apply it. But it's just so the reason why I bring that up is because this whole conversation is set up to guide one to expect the following. It's to say that that the point of the book is to say scientific thinking is not inherently Christian. One does not need to abandon one's scientific thinking. Indeed, people of faith ought to think scientifically, and looking at Einstein will make it clear why all of this is so. And I don't know that the book delivers on those expectations, at least in my judgment. There's a lot about Einstein. And it is interesting because when Torrance talks about Einstein, and when he talks about his aphorisms where he invokes God not playing dice, God not wearing God's heart on his sleeve, and all the rest, one of the things he is at least occasionally careful about putting out is this notion that Einstein is not a Christian. Einstein is not thinking in terms of the incarnation. Einstein is talking about his particular view of the world, and at points even will point out that Einstein sees himself as being a kind of pantheist. He was being kind of a Spinozan, a deus sine natura. And I think that's fair, except for the fact that it's almost taken as given that we're supposed to see the connections between Einstein's metaphysics and Christian theology. And to me, at least, especially coming from a particularly Torrancean perspective, that connection is weaker, considerably weaker than I would like it to be. So, for example, in the index, there is, under Jesus Christ as a subject, there are 3 references in the book. The first one, so I mean, it is against the Torrance background. I mean, if there's an essay where Torrance refers to Jesus only 3 times, I would be surprised. But the first one, sorry.
Well, I counted more than that, but using a digital search. Go ahead, page 87.
So page 87 is in the context where he says the scientific perspective may find itself sympathetic to a fourfold witness to Jesus of the Gospels. So, he then compares the relation of Kepler, Galileo, and Newton to the one rational unity that Einstein affirms to being very much parallel to that between the apostles and the one Lord. And that, I guess, strikes me as rather a remarkable comparison. But I mean, there's a certain level which, well, in as much as the created universe, I don't know that there's any meaningful way we can call that parallel to the one Lord. Is the relationship of the greatest scientists of history to the natural world parallel to those who are bearing witness to God's self-revelation in Jesus Christ?
Only in that they're both reality. He's just affirming that they're both reality. The scientist studies the objective world, and the theologian studies the personal world of the God who created the objective world. That's the only real parallel you could make.
Right. Well, and there are moments here and there where Paul will talk about making contact with reality, which is very strongly up. It's a Polanyian idea that Torrance picks up on, and I think that's valid. But so for someone like me who spent a lot of time digging into Torrance's epistemology, I can see a couple places where you might make that comparison, but it is either giving the reader a lot of credit for being able to make those connections, or it's not making the connections sufficiently, at least for my desire anyway. It is interesting that the second one that in the index is a reminder that Christians, like scientists, make sense out of things through an appeal to a higher rationality. And he comments that, quote, apostasy renders them unable to refine authentically everyday thinking, for their ways are no longer the ways of the universe, nor of its creator. And what is fascinating about that is it immediately leads into a critique of Boltzmann and his demythologization project. So it's very interesting that, and that's interesting because at the beginning, when he talks about the warfare hypothesis, there's a strong theme in the first couple of sections. I don't know how far that gets in the section that Marty posted, where it really, the tone comes off as a bit of saying, most Christians who are not trained scientists do not understand how science ought to behave and scientists actually operate. And therefore, you all better keep your mouth shut for a while until you learn something better, and then you can raise better questions, which may not be untrue. But it is not, in my judgment, a great way to win friends and influence people. And the reason why I say it is, so when I think about what was so captivating to me about Torrance, is Torrance will say things like, you know, where scientific thinking is knowing things, is investigating things according to their nature, cataphysin. And this idea is, and he says, yes, this has been a massive revolution in scientific thinking, that we are really, we have, you know, physics especially is really moving in this direction where we are treating things not in accordance to our frameworks that we have artificially clamped down on creation, but according to the nature of creation as we derive from creation itself. But there's always a sense there where he says, this is really not altogether unlike what we see going on in people like Athanasius in the early church, this unpacking of the centrality of the incarnation. And so there's always a sense for Torrance that when he says we are having conversations with scientists, we're learning, we're seeing how Einstein behaves, there's always a sense of we're not really learning from Einstein because he's Einstein. We're learning from Einstein because in Einstein, we are hearing reminders and resonances with what the church has already known. We already learned this. We may have forgotten it. We may need to be reminded of it. This may be, we as Christians can read people like Einstein as being, you know, prophets being sent up, you know, from an unknown people, you know, to call God's people to repentance and to call, you know, to jealousy and be reminded of these things. But there's no sense of that in this book, you know, in any capacity. It's mostly, here's Einstein. He's a great scientist. You don't know what science is. Be quiet and learn better. And then he also launches this critique of demythologization. And so it seems as though he's really trying to make enemies of both sides of this kind of issue, which maybe is a redeeming quality. You know, it is not clear who. So Paul clearly identifies Boltzmann as being an apostate, but he does not have any parallels. He doesn't have anybody that he would call an apostate within the history of science. He does, however, the comment appears at the end of a section that's being very careful to distinguish science from technology. You know, emphasizing, so for example, people say, if someone were to say, well, science has created all of these monstrosities, you know, the nuclear, you know, war, things like that. Ian Paul very clearly wants to say, no, science didn't do that. The technologists did that. So he might be saying that the technologists generally might be what he's considering the scientific apostates, but is not abundantly clear, at least to me.
Is not technology applied science, though? I mean, technology can't work without scientists providing the resources. So it's like, I mean, it's a little bit of the gun, you know, it's not the gun that kills people, it's the person that shoots it. I mean, there are parallels of, you know, how do you really separate these things?
Well, and I do appreciate that Torrance does try to make that distinction as well. This idea that in a world where we have become excessively dependent on technological advance, and it is easy to imagine that because of the ways technology leaning on science has made our lives different, not to say better, there is a sense in which one could easily take the excesses of technology and use it as a way to say, this is why science is no good. We should abandon science. And so at least there's some parallel in Torrance with that.
Right. So Bryden's got his hand up there. Let's What you got for us, Bryden?
It may not be relevant at this point, Travis, so apologies if it isn't.
I don't know that
The
anything I have to
film
say is relevant.
Oppenheimer.
How relevant?
To what? Relevant to what, brother? That's a moot point in itself. Sorry. Terrible pun. Terrible pun. Oh, the film Oppenheimer. What I find interesting about that film is that you have to kind of go, okay, particularly at the end when you finally get what the conversation between Einstein and Oppenheimer was down by the lake, which this jealous idiot kind of has a paranoia about. I mean, I'm not going to go there in the film, but what I'm going to do is this. At the Barth Conference in Oxford in 1986, celebrating Karl Barth's 100th birth, Rowan Williams gave a very potent lecture on Barth's take on the atomic bomb being a status confessionis. And that's what I want to talk about. You're talking about the relationship between science and technology. Yep, got it. Now, the direction in which you point the gun, got that too. It's the person who's holding the gun and pointing the gun. Now, when you start to raise the stakes with that comment, status confessionis, in other words, you're saying, hey, this thing should never have been invented. Or what are you saying? Which is almost a statement, because you can't disinvent any of this damn stuff. Once it's there, it's there. You know, boom. The best you could do is do a salt treaty or something. I mean, you know. The fact is, status confessionis is equivalent to not putting a pinch of incense on the emperor's altar. So, you know, the stakes are pretty high here. And you're not just talking about Cyprian's De Lapsis or something else like that, you know, how to invite you back into the fold. You're saying, hey, there's a real fence here. There's a barrier here. There's a ditch here. And to cross that ditch is a superb human error. At least that's my take on Rowan Williams's lecture. Now, Rowan Williams is not right about a lot of things, with respect. I mean, sorry. I'm a great fan of Robert Jensen's review of one of Rowan Williams's books. But that's a thing that Rowan Williams loves to ask questions and never actually lands where Torrance lands, which is to say, Jesus is it. Lock, stock, and barrel, incarnation to ascension, that's it. You know, wonderful. Rowan never quite gets there, but that's a... So status confessionis, how do you respond to what I'm trying to suggest here in the relationship between science and technology, and what this book, I mean, frankly, I kind of felt chastened, humbled, and annoyed in the pages you gave us. There you are. That's a big spiel from me. Sorry, brother.
Yeah, well, I mean, that is definitely, to me at least, how the first pages come off. You know, it's very much, you know, so I say you Christians, but clearly I'm a Christian, and so is, you know, Dr. Paul. And this idea of you Christians you're so mad about this, but you don't even know what you're talking about. And I again, so I appreciate the fact that he is a person who, you know, came to theology by way of natural science. You know, he was a scientist first, and then he became a theologian. And I imagine that it's got to be frustrating as a trained scientist who's done actual scientific research, walking into a community who, you know, doesn't really understand what it's like. And one of the things that happens, I think this is probably outside of the pages that were provided, is he shares a series of anecdotes. And the sense that I get, at least, is the purpose of the anecdotes is to make it clear there is no overarching anti-Christian meta-narrative of practicing research scientists. You know, they're doing what they do. He tells one story about a scientist who would gather with his colleagues, you know, at the pub. And then once he got married, he stopped doing that and would go home instead. And then one day showed up at the pub with them, and they all said, "Oh, hey, how's married life?" And he went, "Oh my goodness, I forgot." And he ran home. And the idea, at least the sense that I get, is this idea, and this has been a story that's been told about, you know, several folks, is that you're being so absorbed in the problems of science, the problems of your research, to be so focused on those things, you forget other things. It's not necessarily because they're trying to destroy historic Christian faith. It's that they're just so caught up in what they're doing. They're going where the research leads them regardless. And I think it's a fair point. And I think that is a situation that the Christians across the board probably ought to be more aware of. But it's one of those things where, again, the tone of it just comes off. But perhaps I don't know what the frustration that he may have felt when he went into parish ministry. If he's surrounded by people saying, aren't you glad you finally came to the life and you had a Paul, experience where you realize everything you gave your life to was a lie. I can imagine that would be very frustrating.
So he asked the persistent question of why think scientifically. I mean, he's kind of
he sure does.
Yeah, I mean that is what he lands on as his repeated theme, and then his final closing statement in the book is that why not ask why think theologically, but that would take another essay. So at some level, he's assuming that people aren't thinking they should think scientifically, and they don't even know, as you say, what that would mean. So he's going to try and school us on that. He doesn't imply in the way that Torrance does that to think scientifically is to think theologically. So the idea that there actually is another essay that needs to be written is kind of missing the point that would be there even in the title, Science, Theology, and Einstein. That Einstein is somebody who is modeling for us ways of thinking that they're true in both cases, even though Einstein himself didn't go there.
So the closest we get to an answer is towards the end of the book. This is on page 127. It says, it says, Einstein answered the question, why think scientifically? A scientist ought to think scientifically because it is his most effective way to increase humankind's apprehension of the natural order. So that's the answer. That is the closest we ever get to an answer to this question. But of course, to me, that begs the question, because the book has not explored alternatives to scientific thinking, as genuine rivals to it. It seems wide of the point because the implied people who are he's imagining having a conversation with could not possibly be satisfied with that answer. Why should we think science? Why should we think scientifically? Because science is the best. But at no point, the whole book is concerned and consumed with this idea of this is how Einstein does science. There's no, with the occasional notion of this is where Einstein may think making a step beyond Newton, for example, and beyond Clerk Maxwell. But it's one of those things where this answer that he gives us for why we should think scientifically is not, in my judgment, an answer to the question. I think about, Paul Feyerabend raises the question of, what makes science so good? And he says a lot of times people don't have an answer for that. They just kind of stomp their feet and just say it louder. But it's interesting because, and that he ends by saying, like you said, why, perhaps surprisingly, his answer raises the question, why think theologically? But a responsible reply would require another essay. But I don't think that it's surprising at all, given the tone of the book. Because the book began with an acknowledgement that some Christians object to science, and that at least some of this might be due to a lack of understanding as to what science is and how it operates, which is a fair critique. But the majority of the book is taken up with answering not the question, why should Christians take science and scientific thinking seriously, but what did Einstein think of the nature of science? And so we're left with the impression that the essay that Paul really wanted to write was one extolling the scientific and epistemological brilliance of Einstein, but felt compelled to shoehorn in these theological reflections into it. So really, I mean, instead of being science, theology, and Einstein, it should be Einstein, science, and theology. And by theology, even, it's really more Einsteinian metaphysics, which is theological in a sense, but it's not theological in the sense of Christian.
He did throw just enough seasoning in there for Torrance to probably say, yeah, you're on our team. But so Ken's got his hand up here. Ken, what do you got for us?
Yeah, I'm going to say the title of the book is Science and Theology. Science is a thing, theology is a thing, and then there's Albert.
Right.
And Albert he's not including Einstein as a typical scientist or as a typical theologian. He's someone who has something to say to both camps. collapse. Because really, there's a whole section in the middle of it, and the entire book is a single essay. And it one long argument, mostly addressed to what the stereotype image of scientific thinking. And the stereotype image of scientific thinking is just give me the facts. All I want are the facts. If it's not fact, I'm not interested. Or doubt everything, going all the way back to Descartes. And they were sacrificing the whole Christian tradition and any relationship with the Bible or Christian theology. That's the science stereotyped behavior of scientists that have parents, even here in good old Philadelphia, where the Quakers said, you can say, go where you want and think what you want, fine. But parents will say, I don't want to send my kids to that school because they will teach them to hate their faith. And there are all sorts of, I actually witnessed a parent welcoming their child back at Thanksgiving break and saying, are you still going to church? The stereotype is that modernity in general is skeptical, and scientific modernity is flat out atheist. So to those scientists, and as far as technology, he says, yeah, there are scientists who do most of their work in technology, which is to say, if you think like Steve Jobs was a scientist, you don't understand Steve Jobs. And the biggest corporation in the world is not a scientific corporation. It doesn't do scientific research. It just grabs whatever they think they're going to tack into the next version of the iPhone to sell more iPhones. It has nothing to do with science. It could be radically anti-scientific and anti-religious because all it is a device. Anyway, so that for one thing, he wants to introduce Einstein to scientists, people who are work and play and do everything, calling themselves scientists, and when in fact they are not scientists. And for that purpose, he will introduce Einstein in order to say, here is the true scientist. This is let's look how Einstein's hermeneutic can critique the popular scientism and take it down a whole lot of pegs. In the process, also occasionally looking to the Christians and saying, see, when you talk to a real scientist like Albert, with his almost childlike innocence, he's not scary at all, and you don't need to be scared of science. You really don't. In fact, you might even be interested in learning something about it, because as was already been said, we can't unsee what we have already seen. We cannot go back. So that Paul did not write this book to show all the intimate connections between science and religion. Torrance had already written that book, but he, as a practicing scientist, somebody who was he went into his scientific vocation already a Christian. His alumni magazine, when he died, said that they thought it all rather remarkable that he went and got a PhD in chemistry, being so devout. But he went and got a PhD in chemistry, and he was always trying to bring them together. He never accepted the premise that to be a good chemist, you have to be a bad Christian or no Christian at all. Not going there. But there, just to reflect, there are the largest college in the country, which is Liberty University now, really always constantly trying to grab the prestige of science without ever studying science. And that is a real problem in American popular culture, because Dr. Paul finds over and over and over again, when he brings up science, people think, oh, you mean radical skepticism. But no, I'm not talking about that at all. They bring up science again and say, oh, you mean the technology is its own reward. The old classical virtues are gone. If it doesn't work like science, it's not true. Logical positivism gets a major drubbing in here. And there is a school of Christian logical positivism, and that's when he goes after Bultmann. He says, look at what he is saying. Well, all the parts of the Bible, he takes out his Jeffersonian scissors and tries to scissor out, is exactly the kind of stuff that a scientist would be reverent towards, because it's part of the integrated whole of the New Testament. You can't do that scientifically. You can only do that through your own radically self-conceived notion of what is normal and what is abnormal, and then cutting out all the abnormal parts. That's that is why he went after Bultmann, for that positivism. It's because he said a true scientist is not a logical positivist. And then when he goes back into Einstein's hermeneutic, he says, look how feeling and emotion, and I love this word, voyeuristic modeling, all this fanciful stuff that the scientists who had a dream about a snake swallowing its tail, and then realized he was thinking about the structure of molecules that form rings in benzene. That for most people who want to make a distinction between scientific thinking and poetic thinking, that guy is a heretic. But Paul holds him up as typical, and I think even has Einstein say, see, that's how imagination and fancy and poetry is part of the scientific method. It is not banned. It is not ruled out. But eventually, what must happen is you stay in touch with reality, that you keep contact with the natural world and always bring your thought back to that, which is good advice for a theologian when you're talking about the Bible. Keep bringing it back to the Bible. Keep bringing it back to the Bible. That's where I think he sees the unities, but that's not the book he was writing. The book he was writing is scientists learn to think like a scientist like Einstein. You'll stop making bombs that can blow up half the country. And general popular people in our highly technological culture learn what real science is, because it's reverent and humble, and most of all, it's tacit. There's no such thing as laying down an absolute law and saying that's the law of science, and then do awful things like social Darwinism, in the name of science. To the point where Darwin himself had to put a big X through the page when first time he read Spencer, and says, no, that is not it. That is not what I meant at all. See? Okay, I think I've...
So it sounds like you see the book as taking on the prejudice of both Christians and scientists, and using Einstein as an avenue forward for both of them to rethink epistemological methodology.
Exactly.
And
I think that's why Tom went ahead and edited the book, and God knows it needs an editor still, but he allowed it to go out the door. I remember in my English class in high school, they said, banish the passive voice. This entire book is written in the passive voice. The only time it moves to the active voice is when he's quoting someone else. So that's his 10 years in chemistry writing papers about free radical ions.
So there's a value in what you said. I mean, I think Travis's point is he didn't really help the theologian to understand how to use the Einsteinian principles.
No.
And that would have been a much more helpful addition had he done that along the way. So he did the critique. Yep.
There are 2 chapters in here where Tom says, let's look at how we would do the theology of light. What can a theologian learn from the new physics and bring it to bear on its task as theologians? and he did a darn fine job. I thought that was one of the more
Yeah.
compelling chapters. It was beautiful.
So you're saying that Paul had in the back of his mind that TF has already written some of the things that we'd like him to include here.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
so he
I think-
didn't feel compelled as much into introducing Einstein well, as Travis has said that he did,
Yeah.
is
No,
a
I-
contribution.
Mm-hmm. Travis, did you go to Princeton and read the same stuff in scattered all about Princeton from Einstein?
No. No, but I'm familiar. I'm familiar with his writings throughout, his published writings in Albert Einstein, Philosopher, Scientist, and Out of My Later Years and The World as I See It, and some of his other works. I mean, Einstein really is. So part of my journey to Torrance and towards philosophy of science was I read Torrance, found his description of science just utterly compelling, and then I picked up Alistair McGrath's 3-volume Scientific Theology and found a picture of science that was largely amenable to what I had read in Torrance. And then, I kept seeing Einstein quoted, so I picked up Einstein, and boy, gosh, that's really consistent too. And I read, Michael Polanyi, The Personal Knowledge, and I'm like, wow, this is all very consistent. And I picked up Roy Bhaskar. I'm like, wow, this is all real. This must be the consensus position. And then I stepped outside of that and I realized, no, it is not the consensus position at all. It is a absolute minority position. I managed to pick up every major thinker, who had kind of articulated that perspective. And that in so many ways is what really got me excited about what Torrance was doing, is Torrance wasn't necessarily saying, here is the received tradition of science. We bow at that altar. We receive from the priests of science. He says, these are people who have tapped into a perennial commitment to and rigorousness of thinking in understanding reality. And this is something that I have also seen in Athanasius and a handful of other folks. And so I do want to absolutely affirm the fact that Einstein being held up as an epistemological exemplar is absolutely worthy, material. I guess part of my frustration, I think, with the book was that it's not sold that way. It's sold as, we're going to deal with what science is, and it just talks about here's how one particular person thought about science, which maybe Torrance would be on board with because Torrance is in favor of Einstein. But I think that if we talk to at least now, there's also quite a few disparaging comments here about philosophers and historians of science, which would be very interesting to hear what Carrie has response to that as well. And I appreciate that some of this might be a little bit of a bias on myself as someone who is very interested in what historians and philosophers of science have to say. But I expect that there are probably many people, even who are otherwise sympathetic to Dr. Paul's aims, who might say, you have captured Einstein well, but Einstein is not the entirety of science. One of the things that's fascinating, that gets quoted in here several times, is he said there's a moment, and this is in I think it's an address he gives to, I believe it's the Prussian Academy, where he says nobody who's gone into the matter can doubt the fact that basically, while you could have a multiple perspectives on a science, you might have new rivals to a scientific theory. He says one always rises to the top and gets the consensus because one will command the imagination and command the attention of the people, which is really interesting because it wasn't all that long after he made that address that exactly that happened with the quantum theory, and it was not Einstein's perspective, and he stalwartly refused, to acknowledge that as the superior. Now, I'm not saying he's wrong to do it. I just think it's fascinating that one of his interesting philosophical epistemological perspectives has such an interesting historical development, because one of the things you find in reading other historians and philosophers of science is that Einstein very quickly became known as this weird old kook who holds on to strange ideas like determinism, not in a rigid not like Laplace, that everything is cause and effect, locked in time for eternity, but this idea
Causation is the term in this book. This book, he talks about causation. He won't let that go, but that's not determinism.
Sure. Okay. So it's one of the things where, again, we start off so aggressively with this notion of why think scientifically, and the answer is essentially at the end is given is because science is great, which is, I think we should think scientifically. I think science is great, but there was never at any point an articulation for why science is great, why science is better than the alternatives. Why should somebody, a great case is made for why should committed Christians be less worried about what actual scientists are doing, but at no point was there a positive argument for why science is better than its alternatives. And so I guess I'm thinking about if I were, if this were an examination, or if I was examining this as a thesis, I would say, you never prove your thesis. Your reason for writing this book, as you yourself stated, is never met. And that's the thing that's frustrating. Like, if he had introduced it differently, then much of the same book could be written. But then the question I wonder is, would it fit in with Torrance's series? Which is part of why I think part of why I began with that anecdote about Downing, because I sometimes wonder if it's like I want to fit in with my Dr. Father's series. I mean, what a great honor, and yet I wonder, it reads so much like traditional natural theology, to me at least.
No, that's not there. If you are tracking Einstein, it's the amateurs, the people who want the prestige of science to be the parsley to decorate their ham. They are the ones who use the scientific language unscientifically, or absolutize certain axioms of what they understand to be science, like evolution or the developmental hypotheses, and then ride it like a hobby horse all through sociology, psychology, and everything else, claiming to be scientific, when in fact they're not. They're being bigoted. And his most severe criticisms are against people who try to use the prestige of science and the language of science to do unscientific things. And it's to them he's saying, you must learn from a true scientist, a true prophet in Israel, how to think scientifically, because you're not doing it very well. One of his first stories is how Newton made a mistake in his three laws of motion, and it was 200 years to get that mistake taken out, because everybody absolutized it because Newton said so. And if you were going to be a scientist, you had to follow what Newton said, and you had to do it in his way. And that became almost a slavish imitation, and real science stopped. It no longer went forward. Tom himself will put this into a more of a European intellectual context and say, notice how when he injected a dualism between time and space and created an absolute time and an absolute space, he forced a false construal on all physics, and physics could not operate fully and completely for decades afterwards because of that mistake. And his prestige and his authority, Newton's, almost made that into a cosmological law, and that only heresy could break down and remove. And Einstein was the heretic. That is, I think, the burden of his argument here, is that real science cannot be co-opted by technology, and real science cannot be co-opted by commercial culture or anything else, because it's humble and modest and applied to a very narrow range of questions. So that you really do have to be, like Einstein, an optimist, to think that somehow this is all going to work out. But in the meantime, it is doing marvelous things, and I do like my iPhone. All right, so.
Well, let me try to clarify what I mean by saying natural theology here, because I may not have expressed myself very well. What I mean is this notion of by rigorous study, rigorous scientific application, exactly as we're talking about Einstein doing, what we end up with a notion of the rational structure of the universe as being the metaphysical ultimate to which all of our investigation leads us. And so one of the things that Tom Torrance would then come up and say is, yes, but that falls far short of the actual God as actually revealed in Jesus Christ. We can study the creation all day long with the most absolutely genuine scientific perspective, and yet it does not actually tell us anything about who God actually is.
Right.
And so there's this notion here. I mean, so he does say, by discovering the rational structure of the universe, the scientist discovers God himself. But Einstein qualified this assertion repeatedly. The scientist's religious feeling takes the form of a rapturous amazement at the harmony of the natural law, which reveals an intelligence of such a superiority that, compared with it, all the systematic thinking and acting of human beings is an utterly insignificant reflection. And so this notion of Einstein's God, the God that Einstein's science leads him to, is, at one point Einstein says, is Spinoza's God. This it names it explicitly as being a pantheistic understanding of God. And that's what I mean when I'm saying it's a natural theology, in as much as there are moments here where we're claiming scientific rigor leads us to God, but without an acknowledgement that our object of study is different. Without an acknowledgement that we are, rather than studying the natural world, we are applying the same level of care and commitment and rigor to understanding God as revealed in Jesus Christ.
But what most people would hear with natural theology is William Paley,
Okay.
the watch clock, the watch
Sure.
in the field argument, the argument from design, the argument of the and all these others. Those
Sure.
arguments.
Yes,
Paley was neither a scientist nor much of a theologian either.
Sure.
And one of the things that Paul really does critique is a science where every time you find an exception in your research, you just add an ad hoc exception to your general rule, and you never go
Sure.
back and rethink the rule. He says that the
Sure.
problem was the rule was wrong to be. Let me qualify that, because he has a couple of pages where he says, as critical as I can be about Newtonianism as practiced by the old science, much of everything that Newton said still is valid. That's the nature of science, that when he's right, he's right. And he makes a list of things that where the Newtonian mechanics is everybody's go-to, including the U.S. Navy. When they fire those cannon shells, they don't worry about space-time relativity. They just use plain old Newtonian mechanics. They know that the shell is going to come down in the middle of Beirut. That's where it's going to do. That is what most people think about with science.
Sure.
And what he also, there's I think 8 pages at the very end of this book, Science and Religion, Openness and Justification, where he is quite critical of Einstein's perceived theology, or that he's quite critical. Same very much in the way you quite accurately captured it. He does not mistake Einstein for a Christian. And he insists, even in writing this book, that you can study science, real science, just be a disciple of Einstein and buy the hut next to his house and just live there and never become a Christian. But to Christians, is it don't worry about the true scientific method, because it does not invade, capture, assault, harass, or annoy. It's just asking questions. It's scientism that makes parents nervous, because they don't know where it's going to go, and
Sure.
most are not scientists. They're scientismists, if I have to coin a word, and can be quite abusive. And if that person gets into psychology, you're going to have a lot of very confused people. If that person gets into theories of education, you're going to have a lot of problems. If you have people who absolutize dogmas in their field of work, the work is going to stop, even though you might be able to get technological innovation out of the firm for decades and make a fortune. But science, that has stopped.
Well, I think it's fascinating. The actual scientists that I've known over the years have often not only been more radical in their that there are no hard and fast rules. There's the reality that actually I've had I have one friend of mine in particular who's been teaching in religion and science in Hong Kong, but he was educated as a quantum mechanic, and he taught epistemology and quantum theory for several years. And whenever I come up and I kind of feel like I'm pushing up against the edge of something where maybe I'm overstating something, maybe I'm going too far, he's the one who pipes up, says, "Travis, you're wrong, but it's because you haven't gone far enough." And he kind of says, "Well, actually, the problem is much worse than you think it is." But what I found is that the people who I've known, at least just from my experience, when I was saying that I have not experienced Christians objecting to science as such, but what I have seen is a lot of people who I have met over the years and known who are the most gung-ho, science is the final word, science is the one who determines what truth is. My understanding of science is what actually is the case. And especially that's also why I don't believe in God, for example, have tended to be the stereotypical person I've known like that have been, English majors and literature majors, and all the rest. And they have no science, they will be quick to point out to say, well, Travis, you're a theologian, you're a pastor, you don't necessarily have any scientific background. And it's like, well, okay, you're right. I am not now, nor have I ever been, a practicing research scientist. That is the truth. I will own that. But at the same time, I'll be darned if I'm going to be lectured about that by somebody whose highest scientific background was watching Bill Nye the Science Guy in middle school. That's not, hardly a position, of authority. But that's been and there was a cartoon, a webcomic that someone was talking about how much, I love science. And it's a slightly crude comic, but I'll censor it slightly, where it says, you don't love science, you like watching science's butt as it walks by. And while it's a bit crude, but I think that there's a certain amount of that. Well, yeah, I think there's a certain amount of cultural, accuracy in that comment, where we had this notion of science this, science that, when much of what people mean by what they say has nothing to do with actual practicing science whatsoever. The stereotypical mind of this is how a scientist operates is not necessarily what's actually going on in actual laboratories. And again, I think as far as
I think COVID threw another piece in there, because a lot of people in the Northwest here, we had a lot of anti-maskers, and people literally left their jobs. They were unwilling to put up with what they were being told was the scientific opinion. And so the church, there's obviously the right churches and left churches, but there were a lot of people who I know who they just said, science says this, then I can't believe science. I have to believe God or something. And so that was a pitting that's very fresh in the minds of people in the places that I work and function with. The statement on page 4, the habit of fear is displayed by a considerable number of Christians. People do have a fear of science controlling, and that science is used, I think the word weaponized, that science has become weaponized for agendas. Who's weaponizing it is a good question, but it's taken on this whole nother dimension that I think this book is wanting to get at, though it's not seen to recognize just the way that culture has become polarized around what is science supposed to do, and what kind of authority do we grant it, particularly in our everyday lives.
Yeah,
As a therapist, the idea of fear is to say, in a sense, this is a therapeutic book. He's wanting to get people away from the fear of science, and also away from the fear of Christian thinking, that neither one of them need to be feared. And so to say, there is a way that we as human beings engage reality, that empirical is to say at some level, the reality that we encounter. And that's the way forward. And Einstein simply wants to intuitively and thoughtfully and tentatively at some level to proceed into that, and not get locked into the prison of the right or the prison of the left that fear will ultimately lock you in. Did you want to respond to that, Travis?
No, I think it's accurate. It's one of those where my objection is not even necessarily to much of the content of the book. It's that I still am waiting for an answer for why think scientifically, and I think and maybe my expectations are unrealistic. And that's part of why one of the early questions I asked was, has somebody else been in a situation where they have heard the Christians that they know say we ought not to think scientifically at all? Because that has not been, and I live in a position where there were quite a lot of people who were saying, well, we have to have faith over fear, for example. And there were questions about those situations. But even still, I don't tend to ever hear anybody say we ought not to think scientifically. It's these other peripheral issues. And so I'm trying to understand if there's a historical and cultural gap that I need to get over, where this would, in its original context, would read more clear to the intended audience than it was to me. That it is possible that someone might walk away saying, oh no, I know exactly why we ought to think scientifically, in a way that to me, the question of why is science better than its alternatives is a live question in a way that may not have been in 1982 when this was written, or sometime like that.
And
is
I like to push it the other way to say that the nature, when I taught reading the Bible relationally, I begin by saying reading a Bible relationally is being more scientific. It's being more attentive to the nature of who is the author, what is the intent of that author, what is the implication of the intent of the author, divine and human, and how do we live in the light of that? So it's a katafusan kind of way of thinking. So why we should think scientifically is it's both humble and pursuing what is the nature of the world and the persons that we engage so that our lives live more appropriately in the light of reality and not with, and this is where the word natural theology becomes important, the myths, the delusions, which he does have a section on that so easily seem to entrap people. And it just, I mean, the word propaganda, you almost can't, propaganda, when it becomes everything, then it's not just a little bit, you just go, we don't, how today does anybody find something that they can say, I think that is truthful on TV? Because it just all seems to be so couched and all that. And so the nature of being more scientific is to say, we need to recognize something that is true and the propositions of those, and this is his Bultmann critique, of things that look like they might be true, but they're actually trying to just take power for themselves and really derail everything. So the nature of why I think scientifically is because we need to engage the truthfulness of reality to live lives that are faithful to reality, which includes the dimension of the personal, God, and other humans. Now, Bryden, I know you have your hand up, and Ken, you wanted to say something. I'm going to give Bryden first, and then we'll go to you, Ken. Is that okay? Go for it, Bryden.
Thank you. Interestingly, I spent part of my life in Central and Southern Africa, and I had a wonderful lecturer in history of sociology, who was a South African. He gave up on the Dutch Reformed Church. Why is the intro important? One of his critiques of the European culture in Southern Africa and Central Africa, which we faced in, well, Rhodesia/Zimbabwe, was they didn't have a period of the Enlightenment, was his assessment. Now, what he meant was that the type of Christianity that was prevalent in certain circles was precisely the people that actually you've never met, Travis. Because they were, in fact, of the type that said science is of the devil. Because in his language, this is Charles Roberts's language, they were people who had missed out culturally what the Enlightenment did to Europe. In other words, it enabled it to start to think afresh. You know, literally, dare, that fabulous Kantian word, dare, you know, dare to know. So there's a sense in which the culture of a certain class of people can be trapped. And we're now, I mean, and this is the other thing I wanted to say, we're now trapped with a certain class of politician that wants to use scientism as its weapon, because they want to stay in power. And so they'll use whatever hook is apparently culturally useful. And I mean, that seems to me to be the flip side of exactly the thing that Charles Roberts was saying, if you follow my logic. That I find a line of conversation worth pursuing, but I don't think it's exactly what you're saying or what Albert Einstein is saying, because when you're trapped inside a non-enlightenment environment, you're fearful. You don't dare to know. You don't explore. And I think that's the fascinating thing. When politicians tell people, no, we are going to keep you safe, and this is how we're going to do it. It's a very similar kind of dynamic. It's just the flip side of it. Now, that may not be relevant to this particular book, but it's relevant to the conversation it promotes. And anyway, so there you go. That's a stab at the audience that sort of, in fact, fit with what he's saying in the opening pages, for what it's worth.
Okay.
I'm curious as to whether that audience would find this book helpful. I mean, that's
the answer is they wouldn't know, because they wouldn't understand what the hell he was doing. So, I mean, Charles Roberts would. I mean, I can think back to my undergraduate days in the early 1970s. He would go, "Oh, yay, yeah, go on, sock it to them." But you see, if you're not in a position to receive something culturally, socially, this stuff's going to go straight through you, straight through the wicket keeper. And actually, it won't even be stopped there. Anyway, there you go.
Very good.
English cultural
Good.
reference. Wicket keeper. All right.
Yeah. Sorry, mate. I mean, it's the backstop that in fact fails to fumble, and off it goes to the boundary for 4 byes. There you are. I'll push the metaphor to the end, kid. I couldn't resist.
You're good. You're good. The first footnote, and let me just put a little aside here. I have never seen a footnoting technique like this ever before. I mean, the entire essay is all the same set of notes. And if he is citing the same book in the same place elsewhere, occasionally he'll use Ibid, but occasionally he just uses the same index note out of order. So you, in one page, there was a footnote number 103, number 33, and at the bottom 302. I mean, all on one page. My Chicago manual of style jumped off the shelves. It was so offended. But maybe that's the way it's done among chemists in Great Britain. The first footnote is H.I. Brown's recent paper on being rational, American Philosophical Quarterly, 1978. This, he says, reading this paper prompted the writing of this essay. So if you want to know in a short compass who he was writing for, he was following in Brown's suggestion on being rational. If you had titled it "Why Be Rational," you'd be almost having the first chapter of here, and you'd be moving on to his tweaking of that to say, well, then why be scientific? What are the reasons? And he said, because it is the way to be rational, the self-correcting way to be rational, the way that chimes in with our human experience. Because in a way, it was as if Gregor Mendel had written a cookbook on peas after having published on genetics. The being in a monastery doing science and being a chemist doing science, and then preaching in a small Scottish parish while trying to do theology, the book may be a little parochial. It doesn't immediately address the kinds of questions we might ask.
It's a little bit like asking the question, why tell the truth?
Yeah. You could do that in a nursery rhyme, or you could do that in the critique of pure reason. It's all how much time and space do you want to take, and how much do you think you need to go back and rethink the foundations of everything that came before in order to state the full, accurate answer to a simple question: why be scientific? Why think scientifically? And
the world of economics, the world of politics. I mean, the question of being truthful, the judicial systems. I mean, at some level, if you can lie and get away with it, then you have succeeded. So to say, there are large areas of our culture where being able to get away with not telling the truth is seen as a strategic advantage.
Then you can say it's legal, but it's not right. It points right to that gap that we all acknowledge. There's a vast difference between what is legal and what is righteous. And the church is supposed to know something about this. The church is supposed to be able to address itself to these kinds of things. Can we do that if we're not thinking rationally, scientifically about law and medicine and abortion and all these things that where our voice is being asked for and they ain't hearing it? And he's saying because we've been intimidated to say, At least when it comes to nuclear bombs, we're disqualified.
And Bryden says, what is truth? A politician asked that, pointing to the biblical text.
Pilot.
But the answer to it was a person. I mean, so to say this
Mhm.
book at some level is saying there is truth and it is known in a person. And there is some sense in which the word faith, I think as the word faith is developed, there is kind of a Polanyian dimension.
Yeah.
That science and faith are basically the same thing. You have faith in a statement about the world, about the nature of reality, when it is shown to be reasonably true, with an openness that there might be more to be discovered.
Yeah.
And that to say the nature of faith in Christ as Christ is presented, you come to have faith in the one who speaks, who acts, who dies, who witnesses speak about, and their truthfulness in witnessing to who he is and the transformation of their life. In all of that, there is what we would say the faith scientific endeavor that would say, which I think Torrance wants to say, in the end, to call people to faith in Christ is to call them to an appropriate scientific engagement with the nature of the one who made the objective world that science has limited itself to. And in Bart's case, the nature of the church as a scientific community being clear about its language. So if we speak about God, we're not doing what Bultmann is doing, where we're just doing cookie cutter, taking all those things that don't fit us, and God ends up just looking like us. The church has a reasonable call to engage through our language, that which is the object of our study, and to make sure that we're actually getting at the truthfulness that is there. The thing with Polanyi and Einstein that I find here too is, and goes to your point, Travis, Einstein talked about personal knowledge, but he never talked about how you know other persons. It was simply the knowing person, not the knowledge of the personal. And that's where I think John McMurray's work really helped Torrance in the knowledge of the personal, particularly in his work, The Form of the Personal. Einstein never really attempted to know other persons either. There's several of the quotes in here that kind of said, we just can't go there. We can't go into the world of the personal, and even a mere personal kind of engagement was something that he didn't feel like that could even be gone into.
Has that got something to do with his actual personal relationships, though?
With whose actual personal relationships?
Albert's.
Albert's. We'll say a little bit more about that.
I would say so. I would say so. I mean, I'm thinking of his loves, his lovers, his family, the whole fact of, did he get on with his scientific community? Well, some of them, but he was an angular human being at some points.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure why. I mean, I'm no psychologist, and I don't want to be, because the poor man is long since gone. But there was a barrier, I feel, in the stuff that I know about Einstein.
Well, the nature of barriers is what this book is trying to. It's trying to use Einstein to break down barriers, and this would be one of the barriers that would be the logical outcome if we really read Einstein as somebody who takes down the barriers and leaves an openness to reality and inquisitiveness, the journey of inquiring of reality, the use of imagination to see what we would not have seen. I mean, all that's what's required and again, I don't use the word psychology, I use the word therapist, because psychology defaults to a individualist, objectifying certain behaviors and breakdowns, whereas family systems therapy, Bowen style, is field thinking. It goes with Maxwell and Einstein.
Yeah.
I would see it. So to say the nature of, he's attempting to open us up to field thinking, which is a therapeutic task, and to say Einstein actually does that for us. He opens us to the world of field thinking in such a way that we never assume that we can comprehend the whole, but we can apprehend in increasing degrees of accuracy and involvement. And the science of Einstein is going to give us the tools for that. I mean, that's part of the question, or the answer to the question. Science has found tools that help us to do the work of understanding the nature of the physical world and the world of persons, particularly the nature of the God revealed in the person of Jesus Christ. That's the phrase that it would have been nice for Travis to be able to see, that he made that methodological connection, and he didn't, and it wouldn't have been another paragraph to really point that out in a sense.
I do remember that there are several passages, is about page 50 and maybe 54 and onward, where he's talking about delusions and fantasies. And he
Yes.
says everybody alone in their solipsistic life will fall into delusions and fantasies because there's no one to call them out on it. You have to be in community. And he talks very frequently in here about no scientist works alone. Everybody's in constant communication with everybody else. So even Albert, in his time in the patent office, when he has we might as well have been in a lighthouse as far as how much solitude he had. He was reading other physicists' papers. So he was participating in the Republic of Letters, if you want to call it that. But this in communication, even if it wasn't face to face. So he recognized the value of connectedness. But I agree, his reputation in Princeton was that he was, they thought he was maybe borderline, sorry, I'm pulling a complete blank. Not quite able to make emotional contact with other people based on a neuro-differentiated brain.
Right. Well, to say that the nature of all of us is we all have some things that are part of our developmental structures that make us blind to things, that make us hide things about our pasts, our beliefs. So to say there is something about the nature of the human endeavor to engage in authentic human relationships that's very difficult. And Einstein had some brilliances that gave him abilities to see what that looked like with the natural world that could be borrowed for the personal world. And at some level, I think that's what Torrance is doing. I mean, the onto-relational it's in some ways Katafusan and onto-relational. That's Einstein, Polanyi, McMurray thrown together in a embodied concept that again gives us these tools that lead us into a life of worship, into a life of community, into a life of responsible care for ourselves and others. And I mean, that would be the answer of why I think scientifically, is because there's something revealed, particularly in the nature of understanding the world, that allows us to respond appropriately to it, which McMurray gives the illustration of true and false thinking, that if you see a snake on the floor, if you jump, but it's actually a plastic snake, you're not actually responding to reality. If it is a real snake, to jump and get out of the way is a good idea. And so why think scientifically? Because it helps us to understand what is reality and how do we respond appropriately to it. And I think a lot of people think of the church today as an institution that's lost contact with reality. And so what I hear from younger generations, and even my dad, who he was a pastor's kid, he said, you know, I don't see why people go to church anymore. It seems like wishful thinking with nothing that actually has any proof. With empirical thinking, at least I have something that I can engage in reality. And so there's this quest for reality that I think people really do have. And even, you know, the 20s and 30s, that's the word of authenticity and reality is something that they're tired of, something that doesn't appear to be that anymore. And so I think there is an intuition, to use a Torrancean and Einsteinian as presented here. The intuition to truth is something that is actually to be credited as something that we should pursue. And Christians have not done the best job at really providing that. And I think maybe Paul is thinking that he's providing some of that, though I found much of it. I would not be able to give it to any 20 or 30-year-old that I know and expect them to really understand any of it. So the language was difficult, and I had to read kind of slowly at some points and skim at others, because it's like, yeah, I don't need to really get all that. Wait, I see that hand there.
Standing up.
Yeah, actually, I just shared a little story there. John McKenna was telling me a story that Tom told him when Einstein was at a prayer meeting at Theological Center of Inquiry there at Princeton, and he in the meeting he didn't pray, but he actually played the violin. You know, and just in this context, it sort of makes an awful lot of sense, because what kind of language could he actually use to address the unknown God there in the midst of Christians who actually are on a different, relational way of approaching the truth, and because it's like a lot of people that, who hears your cry of pain, who can understand me? We know who can hear our cry, and we know who can understand us, but to everybody else, it's like the story of the quartet playing Near My God to Thee as the Titanic sinks. Someone hear my cry, please.
Yes. Well, it goes to the point that he makes. It wasn't in the part that I copied, where he says, if somebody found a book of or what was it? Euclidean geometry, but it had no pictures in it, the
Right.
words themselves would not provide what is necessary to really get at what it is that's going on. And for many, both Christianity as well as science are just a lot of things that they have no contact with reality, in a sense, with that. And so there is a sense of that contact with reality that I think that Paul is aiming for. And certainly that's Polanyi wrote that, and Esther Meek wrote a whole book on that phrase, contact with reality. That's named, based on Polanyi's work. So I think, again, the answer to the question, why think scientifically, it's because we need to contact with reality. And so much of what we get is not reality. I mean, just the nature of the difference of the words astrology and astronomy. They're both looking at the exact same thing. One of them claims that God is speaking through them. Astrology claims that there are messages and things that we get through that, but that's a human that's projecting something onto it, which is a little bit Boltzmannian maybe in the context of this book. Whereas astronomy is to understand the nature of both what it is, but also to say there's a story there. But the nature of the story of the universe is also tied up, and so we need to be attentive through the methods that we learn about the nature of how the structure of reality in the stars as we observe them can reveal to us the history that brought them to where they are. So why think scientifically? Because it helps us to understand the story within which we are living, how to live in the light of that, and to have some sense that we aren't going to default to the mythologies that so easily are fed to us. So there is a protective dimension to it that calls out all those who would be the charlatans who want to use kind of false knowledge to persuade us. So Bill, you mentioned a pastor who's making a difference in Truth for Life, Alistair Begg in Cleveland. Do you want to say something about him?
No, I'll let him speak for himself. I put a link down there. He is, and also all of his sermons are pretty much on YouTube. He really knows the Bible, and he knows how to deliver the reality of it. It just, his preaching is remarkable, and he does have a organization called Truth for Life that provides additional
And would you say
information.
that his remarkableness is because of the clarity of thought that in any way echoes what is being called here scientific thinking, that there's an epistemology that he helps the hearer to get at something in a particular kind of way? I mean, do you feel that he helps us to see the way a Christian would?
He helps us see Jesus Christ as a reality, for your life. It's a remarkable. He's a Scottish fellow, and still speaks with quite an accent. And
Does he know Torrance? Is he
I
familiar with him?
don't know if he does or not.
Nothing on his Wikipedia page makes it seem as though he does.
Say again?
Nothing on his Wikipedia page makes it seem as though he does. I mean, his back London School of Theology. He has an honorary degree from Westminster, Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania. He says among his influences into Martin Lloyd-Jones, John Stott, Derek Prime, Eric Alexander, Sinclair Ferguson, Dick Lucas,
Right.
Eric Liddell, Spurgeon,
Right.
Jim Elliot, and Hudson Taylor. A lot of those are missiologists, mission folks.
Right.
And conservative evangelical. I mean, in New College sits on the mound in Edinburgh, and 3 doors down is the Free Church of Scotland. And the difference between those two is the difference between a school where you can learn Karl Barth and one where you can't learn anything after Calvin. The dogmatic barriers in the bad sense are going to need a whole lot more treatment. So if this guy's got an award from Westminster, either Westminster is in the middle of a Reformation, or I'd have to scrutinize the reason. Anyway, the fact that he can preach, for me as somebody who worries about getting new people to staff our churches, is they've got to be able to preach. They've got to be able to communicate. They got to know the Bible. They got to be able to communicate the contents of the Bible and do it in a winsome way.
He does a fabulous job in communicating the context of the Bible. That's what really gained my attention. I don't know that he would warm to the theology of Thomas Torrance. I'm not sure that he would, but I just find it remarkable, his knowledge of the Bible.
Well,
Interesting.
Bill, I asked the question, and again, like, it's how do you have contact with reality without the mediation of Christ? Like, it just, you just never get away from it. There is one mediator between God and man, the man Jesus Christ. Like, there's just no other way, and I don't know why or how we think we can do it, for science as well. Like, in the beginning was the Word was God, and the Word was with God. There's nothing made without him. Like, there is no knowledge to the natural knowledge as well, scientifically, as well as theological, without this one whom God's provided for us to tell us, show us, illuminate us.
Yeah.
Right.
At the bottom of page 57, there's one of his nicer kind of statements of engaging something theological. Einstein saw the inquiring, searching, and probing scientist as individually open through intuition to the rationality of the universe or the whole of the natural order. Christians, or at least some of them, so here he's, I think maybe including Torrance, believe that the asking, seeking, and knocking Christian is personally open through the Holy Spirit to the Word of God, by whom all things were made. So that's almost Bardian Torrancean. He is open, this is a Christian, therefore, to the entirety of the divinely created order. And the question there, is he doing a natural theology or a theology of nature with that statement? Which, again, I think Torrance is a theology of nature, and I hope that's what he's saying. From an Einsteinian perspective, it would appear that theological and scientific thinking might have epistemological points of contact. I think that's with each other, not necessarily with the world, but maybe it's the world. Indeed, if a suitable interaction model were found, such apparent parallelisms might provide a way in which science and theology could be mutually enriching. So this is his vision, I think, in the end, is that there's this conversation that enriches both. However, the development of science has repeatedly shown that false paths can be followed by mistaking analogy for evidence. The validity of such parallelisms should be established before they are taken too seriously. Travis, can you say something about what he means there by mistakenly following analogy for evidence?
Well, I mean, how I take it anyway is that this idea of, well, this way of thinking is true in physics, therefore it must be true in psychology. Whereas, at least Torrance, for example, would say, well, that only works if we believe that physical entities and psychological entities are fully parallel, which certainly would take some doing to demonstrate.
So an analogia entis that he's talking about there.
Right, and that's how I read it anyway.
Yeah. So if we followed an analogia fidei or an analogia relationis, then he would say that would be appropriately following the evidence of the God revealed in Jesus.
Well, and that's that. I mean, I took some notes in that section there, and that's, you know, one of the questions that I was raising to myself, at least, was, you know, if these points of contact are meant to be resonances, reminders, you know, those kinds of things, then I think there's a way of interpreting that in a very Torrancean way. But if you're not making some very careful disclaimers about what does it mean to have these points of contact, which, I mean, I think he's trying to be aware of the fact that there is a need to do some of that. But I guess there's the warning, but then there's not like an example of it. You know, there's not, you know, he clearly has something in mind, but didn't tell us what it was.
Yeah. So it's a pointer along the way.
And we kept
Go
the books
down the road that I'm not going to go down.
Yeah.
Yes.
One analogy that he does explore in trying to describe physics is the analogy of the structure of the atom. It was not clarified until about 130 years ago that there was a nucleus and there was a shell of electrons, and all of this language is by analogy. A nucleus that no one has ever seen, and a shell analogous to a eggshell or some other shell or a basketball, whatever. The point being that all of these things are analogies. And where I had to learn this by putting little wooden beads on springs in chemistry class while we tried to build molecules. And the molecule that would be there would be analogous to the actual molecule, except there's no springs, there's no wooden balls, it doesn't go wiggy wiggy, and it cannot be assembled in that way. The analogy is false in as many ways as it's true. And so it just that the fact that you're able to construct a model of a molecule is not proof that molecules like that actually even exist. But that's how most of us carry this stuff around in our head.
Yeah. And as I was in the great cathedrals of Rome and of Greece, there's a sense in which these people have all these images of Jesus and of the stories of the Bible. The Orthodox churches were even more rich in the storiedness of them. But I wonder if the sense that you had there is such an experience without a necessary dimension of the personal that they're really pointing to, that one can merely collapse into the beauty of the icon or the image or the statue and miss the one to whom it points. So we end up with something that is pointing to something, but you end up merely satisfied with the physical thing in front of you. I think that would be similar to the analogy that you were just making there. And so it's true at one level, but it's false at another level.
Yeah, and fails. So
yeah.
And
go ahead.
Go ahead, Thomas.
I would say there's a Protestant equivalent to that too, which is, you know, are looking at the text of Scripture and not being able to see through it to the God to whom it bears witness.
Yeah. Yeah. And Paul in Mars Hill, you know, I see you've got this statue to the unknown God. Let me give you something about the reality to which you have merely an unknownness here. So that's where, Bill, your point about having good preachers is often we're taking the Bible or even the faith of people. It's like, you've had this faith, but you know what? That's just often just us wanting to make Jesus make our lives better. And it ends up being a disconnect from the real God in the person of Jesus. And a good preacher, you walk out going, wow, it's the first time I felt like I've ever really met with Jesus, and the Spirit just opened me up and something penetrated that was never there before. And that's I think one of the marks of good preaching is it brings that dimension of reality to really indwell who we are in a way that we are in Christ and Christ is in us. But it's not just a abstract Christ is in you and you are in Christ that we say it so easily, but you walk out going, so that's what it's like.
That's it.
Did you want to say something, Bryden? You're so attentive there.
Hmm.
No, I'm good. I'm just kind of on the chat a little bit, thinking,
Okay.
well, okay.
Yes, you are chatting, and it's good. On the top of page 59, this beginning at the top paragraph there, many Christians are correspondingly sensitive to the theological significance of the personal freedom of the Christian, which he's been talking about, the personal freedom of the scientist. To infringe this God-given privilege or to surrender it is to identify with disjunctive disobedience. The latter degenerates life to anarchic chaos and culminates in death. It also degrades theological statements to statements without conformity to the self-communication of the Word of God. That's the disconnect you were just talking about in the analogy. There's no longer a connection that's there. Theological thinking is thinking of and grounded in the capital R reality of the economic condensation of God. And that's the person of Christ, I assume he's talking about. This means that the eternal Word, without ceasing to be Word, has accommodated himself to humankind in its weakness and incapacities in order to effect communion. So that's the analogia fide, right? The analogy of faith through the analogia relationis, the relation of Christ. Theological thinking is authentic only insofar as it respires that Word and aspires to his sacrificial communication. Now, he could have said a lot more on that statement, but again, that he's pointing kind of towards what I think, Travis, you're wanting, but you're absolutely right that he leaves us wanting, but he's pointing in the right direction. So I want to recognize what is there and also what is missing. So this dual identification is accomplished through the free personal worship and mission of the Christian. So the nature of the word free there, I'm not sure how he's using the word free. The intriguing fact is that such an alluring parallels between scientific and theological thinking can be sketched so readily. It suggests that a greater familiarity with the nature of scientific thinking might benefit Christians, if only to allow them to distinguish more effectively between the two, which I'm not sure why we go into between the two. So I suppose when it becomes idolatrous, science can be seen as a human attempt for power and authority. But the nature of the connection, most of the book, I think he's trying to see the connection in the usability of the methodology between the two that serves both God and humanity when used appropriately by Christians.
Yeah, this writing here is making me wonder if this adjustment from scientific thinking to theological thinking and all those kinds of things, if that was very intuitive for him when he was working with Torrance, for example.
Yeah.
Because it's the kind of thing where if that was a struggle for him, I would feel he would have a greater burden to be more clear. I mean, because I know that I'm at my worst in communication when something is obvious to me. When something is very, very clear to me, it is very hard for me to explain to somebody else.
Yeah.
Or at least when I think it's clear. So it's possible that it's one of those things where what I'm looking for are questions that have just literally never occurred to him. Because what he's trying to say has come so naturally to him. I don't know that, but that's at least one way to explain where I'm. Questions that I have, he may think, well, nobody's asking that question because it's obvious. Well, I am, but I wasn't. I wasn't writing then.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I want to acknowledge that you're raising appropriate questions, both for you as well as that many others would have in reading this book. And so I both want to honor that he was trying to say things that would speak to particular audiences, and that we need to identify who are those people, and that there probably are whole large groups of people who are neither of the, all science or all kind of theology without science. The world has become much more amalgamated, so the nuancing that would be required, maybe this book points in the directions, but it just couldn't go there because the world wasn't there yet. I was alive in 1982. I was not engaged in these issues, so I can't feel the tenor of the conversation at that point.
Well, and that's the thing. I said I wasn't writing then. I mean, I literally was not alive when this came out. I hate to say that,
Yeah.
But I mean, but I live in a different world, you know. I've
Yeah.
had times where I've read Karl Barth, and it's very clear. I mean, someone else will point out, well, this is why he's responding to this situation, that situation. I'm like, well, I didn't get any of that. Well, it's because I don't live in that world. References that are obvious to him are not obvious to me.
Yeah.
The thing with Barth is I think that it is true that you can read Barth in all those dimensions. I think there is a simplicity because of the Christocentric focus that he always is trying to say the same thing, and these conversation partners are what I call clarifying through distinction. When I say this, I mean this, and I don't mean that. But you can still get the I mean this. And in each generation, the I mean this makes sense, and you can just see, oh, we have new issues that speaks to, which is the Barmen Confession. We affirm this and we reject that. Well, tomorrow there's going to be the Barmen Confession today at Princeton. It's a free conference. Everybody wants to log on to that. And it's doing this work of saying we affirm this and we don't affirm that. And I think that's part of the conversation of, what is appropriate theology? And it needs to be, as you've said, Travis, it needs to really engage the person of Christ, the witness of Scripture in all the ways, katafusin, that Torrance wants to lay out for us. And so we can't do something that just writes off the possibility of God before even having a conversation. Though there was one thing I was reading today that was critiquing Torrance and said, he begs the question of, the obviousness of God, and just says that, all arguments are basically circular, but you have to begin somewhere and then defend it. But he was a non-starter with Torrance because he says, I just don't have a sense of God being there. So I can't go with Torrance and even beginning to allow that God exists to begin to enter into the conversation of using any kind of scientific methodology, including the person of Jesus. It was all non-starter. Much of the world, I think, is in that place where we've collapsed so much into experience that anything, unless you talk about, so how many atoms have you seen, or how much have you seen of the beginning of the universe with its beginning in the 13.8 billion years since then? I mean, have you seen any of that? No. Well, how do you know about it? Well, somebody told me about it. Well, why do you trust them?
One of the things I find fascinating, the opening sections in Michael Polanyi's Personal Knowledge is he says, if we were to make a feature film of the history of the universe, he says anything we would recognize would be like one fraction of the last second. And he said, if we were to prioritize, the amount of space on this film based on physical stuff, he says, then 99 point whatever percent of it would be stellar dust. And he argues that we cannot possibly, we have this, he doesn't say idol, but essentially this idolatry of objectivity that he says is simply not helpful. Nobody wants absolute objectivity because it doesn't help anybody. Well, it's a fascinating take on things.
Yeah.
And Paul makes that point that the science, first of all, he hates the phrase scientific method, because then the method becomes the tail that wags the dog, and every piece of research any scientist does needs to find its own method based on rationality instead of following the scientific method. Apparently, Karl Popper had written a popular apology for theology for the educated public, to say there is a scientific method and it always yields the truth, and we need to use it in everything, all the time, everywhere. And
conjectures and refutations,
and Paul's brain is popping like, oh no. Everything, but that was one comment, and I'm looking at the clock. The other comment is simply a comment. You notice the word dualism does not appear in this book. So this is a somebody who was a colleague of Tom Torrance who did not use that word. So he points to disjunctions and dissimilarities, but in order to get the full-blown Torrancean take, you got to go to Nebelsic or Tom himself. But Paul does not in his little parochial world, he does not experience these intellectual dualisms anywhere nearly as often as other intellectual historians have.
And he didn't see Einstein doing it either, probably.
Exactly. And he picks up Einstein's criticism of Isaac Newton, but he says, here, wait a minute, he made a mistake here. Like the guy who solved an algebraic problem with a curve and accidentally included the period at the end of the caption underneath the picture, and managed to find a curve that fit all the data up in the picture and then the period at the end of the sentence, which had nothing to do with the data at all. It says that is in its own way is logical, it's rational, but it's worthless. And then you really do, every scientist needs to be able to think about worth and value, charity and love and all these things, but that we're supposed to know something about. But if they're not listening to us, who are they listening to? In the meantime, are they including the periods at the ends of sentences as valid data points? It's worth asking. That was the last thing I wanted to get out.
Yeah. And the principle of evolution is competition, not collaboration, which you were just pointing towards that. And so a world in competition is quite interesting. On the cruise, there was an astronomer who did these lectures, and one of them was where the universe came from. And he did, a lot of what would be, kind of traditional, the development of the explosion, all that. He didn't mention it, but there was a little flash at the beginning of it where there were two hands holding the Big Bang. He said nothing, but it's like, how interesting is that? Was he trying to say something? He was not anti-religious, and I just wondered, do even you have to acknowledge there's something there that holds this universe in its hands in a beginning point? So that was really interesting to see an astronomer who would even have that in the slide to raise the question. John McMurray, in the final chapter of his 2-volume set, The Form of the Personal, talks about the nature of the personal universe. And he says, we have to begin with this big question. Is the universe personal or is it impersonal? If it is impersonal, then there's nothing that is necessary. Everything is chance, and we shouldn't look for logic at all. If it is personal, then we should expect that there is order, that we as persons show up and we can find some meaning for why we are persons and the nature of how persons function. But he sees this really big picture that is basically a question of, a kind of science that is atheistic and has no meaning in it, versus what I think Torrance picks up on, that is a science which is deeply personal, borrowing both Polanyi and McMurray, and that the nature of science is going to really begin with the universe is personal because it was created by a personal God. And so everything that we do is going to be an exploration and understanding that can never be conclusive, but it can allow us to live with faith, meaning, and appropriate participation within the nature of reality, which is what I would think why we need to be scientific is we need to participate well in the nature of reality as given. And that includes we are persons in a personal world, in a personal universe, and the fulfillment of what it means to be persons is best explained and lived within that context. Bryden.
Muted. Sorry. Here we go. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. I think one of the problems, though, Marty, is that culturally we're captured by the size of the universe. We're captured by the time and duration of the universe.
Yeah.
These are parameters on our imagination even. Yeah. Because when we get a lot of people commenting on the latest discoveries or CERN in Switzerland or whatever it is,
yeah,
it's all impersonal stuff that in fact is actually being examined. And when we come to the world of human beings, what we're presented with is a very intelligent animal. I watched a documentary the other day on the Neanderthals. Now, they were calling Neanderthals human. Now, I mean, okay, that's a kind of a category issue, not a hominoid, but a human.
Yep.
And yes, we have interbred Homo sapiens is interbred with Neanderthals. We know that at a level of genes. Now, the issue is, I think, in popular imagination, what is the personal? What is a human being? Because if we're a very intelligent animal and we start with that premise, then we can communicate with dolphins because they communicate too. And so I think one of the issues apologetically for all Christians is, what does it mean to be a person?
I like that.
And so, seriously,
Yeah.
because even in family therapy, excuse me, we're just members of the herd, are we not? And the dynamics of the herd are what you're unfolding for us, Marty, family therapist. You're not actually talking about persons. You're talking about the survival of the herd,
Well, that's a whole
etc.,
other
etc.
question. I wouldn't concede that immediately. I would say that there's more to it than that. But anyway,
Yeah, I mean, it's all about the question posed
no,
and
absolutely.
framed. Anyway, oh, you've frozen, mate. Sorry.
I frozen. Oh, so the nature of theology is all about the person. It's a personal God, the triune God who exists as Father, Son, Holy Spirit, and
But
creates us in
what is a
God's image.
person?
Well, but I mean, at least we have a place to begin, right? That's to say, that's what
Yes, we
theology
have a
begins with.
place to begin.
Yeah, that's what theology begins with that science does not. It assumes that there is a category of the personal rather than excluding it as a possibility. Or as I say, science by definition is the study of the world of the impersonal, the objective. But that's a half truth because we know that we are much more than just merely the body and bones of who we are. There is another dimension, and we just have chosen not to explore it because it's almost as complex as the universe.
Oh, brother, don't go complex.
So anyway, I think that
Thank you.
we have been blessed by Travis doing a deep dive into this book, helping us to not just kind of either agree with it or to write it off, but rather to say it really is a call to think about the issues that 40 years ago somebody was attempting to take on, to recognize the challenge both of science and of theology, to not be as aware as would be possible if we would learn from each other better. So it is a call to learning. And I think our session today has been, if anything, a call to learn more and to recognize that we have learned more than they have, but we still have tons to learn. And that there are proposals about what it means to be those who recognize that if Paul didn't write, then Torrance wrote things, and we need to say Torrance didn't give us everything we need either. So we still need the Travises and others who can keep adding to the conversation. And that this book really is a call to an ongoing living conversation with those who have different basic commitments, but that they need not be exclusive, and they might actually invite deeper expansion of learning and knowing and understanding the world. So why think scientifically? Because it is an openness to keep learning. And so hopefully, if nothing else, we are doing that here today. So Travis, thank you so much for your extensive work that you put into it and giving me a break while I was on vacation to not have to prepare all this. So, and for the rest of you, thank you for being here. Next week, we have Jerome Van Kijken with our next chapter in T.F. Torrance's doctorate. So he will take us into chapter 3, which I think is Ignatius, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So anyway, fun things to come. And I think it'll be interesting to think about next week in the light of this today. What was Torrance learning in these early Christian thinkers that was beginning to develop his critical scientific thinking, even as he was looking at Christian thinkers at that point in time. So blessings on you all. Thank you for being here today, and we will see you next week. And I'll try and have clear instructions with whatever the link looks like.
Yeah.
And I may do a
Oh,
new
no,
one
she's
because,
cool. She's cool.
well, this one here requires me letting people in, which I don't want to do. If I can get rid of that needing to let people in, I'll keep this one.
Oh, yay.
I don't like to be a gatekeeper. I like to just you know, the good shepherd is at the gate, and so we'll let him let people in. So,
Stand behind the
Well,
wicket.
I liked it because it worked.
well,
Got
working
in,
is good.
got in,
Working is
got
good.
in.
Okay,
Cheers,
blessings on
everybody.
you all, friends. Thanks.
Bye.
Good to
Bye-bye.
see
Bye.
you again. Good to hear your
Cheers.
voice.